Our Lenten observances are an opportunity for us to revisit and reinvigorate our Christian faith. It is an opportunity for deep reflection on our personal and spiritual character and consult with God regarding areas in need of improvement, while at the same time receiving affirmation for our efforts and progress. It is a chance for us to turn over a new leaf in our faith, so to speak, to make a new you, to develop some new attitudes and change our behavior. Most of us like routine and can easily get into a pattern of behavior that allows us to feel a sense of normalcy and fulfillment. But one danger of routine is the risk of it becoming monotonous, stale, or meaningless. Church settings is one of those places where things can easily become routine. And if we do not pay attention, it can easily become ritualistic and shallow. When Jesus went to the temple that day, he went to the temple and he went there for a purpose. He went to make changes, or at least to set changes in motion. What he found was business as usual. There were animals and money changers there. There were people buying and selling animals for worship purposes. It was, after all, almost time for the Jewish Passover. So, as expected every year, the temple courts would be filled with people selling cattle and sheep and dove, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. For those who don't know, the Passover is when the people remember the exodus from Egypt, when they followed God's direction through Moses to sacrifice an animal and sprinkle the blood on their doorposts, so that it could serve as a sign to the angel of death when passing through the land to not visit their house. This observance was and is repeated annually for all time. So the animal was slain on the eve of the Passover at 3 o'clock, or on the eve of the Passover if it fell on Friday at 2 o'clock. That was the routine that the temple had gotten into. Sacrificial animals were bought, foreign currency was exchanged for sacred money, and sacrificial doves could be purchased by the poor. That was how they had always done things. And there is nothing wrong with this aspect of temple life. Funds needed to be raised for the ongoing work and for the maintenance of the ministry. Money was needed to care for the widows and the orphans and the poor and to meet any societal obligations. Even in these times, money made the world go round too, and it took cash to care. But though this was routine, Jesus' response was shocking. The text tells us that he makes a whip of cords and drives out the sheep and the cattle. He then pours out the coins of the money changers and overturns their tables and tells those selling doves to take them out of the court. And his charge to everyone within listening distance: stop making my Father's house a marketplace. Why did Jesus do this? I would like to suggest 4 things. Jesus did this to advocate. Jesus' righteous indignation was not so much about what was happening, but more so about what was not happening. This part of the temple was called the court of women. It was the only place that Israelite women could worship in Jerusalem. Women, after all, could not go beyond this point into the court of Israel unless they were bringing a sacrifice. Without getting into the issue of separation of genders, let us recognize that the very place that the women did have to worship was not conducive to do so. The women were being displaced. On the eve of International Women's Day, celebrated on the 8th each year, this lectionary text could not be more fitting. We can view the story from the perspective of Jesus advocating in very disruptive ways for women who have been displaced in the society, for women who struggle to get into the spaces traditionally not designed for them, for women who are placed at a disadvantage because of their gender, for the still prevailing perception of women as the ones who do the mothering and the delicate work and who are kept out of leadership because of this prevailing perception. And Jesus went to the temple to drive out these perceptions, to disrupt the routine that sometimes even the church gets into, to bring in a new way of being, a new attitude. Jesus is calling us to change our perspective and how we view and treat women. But the second thing that Jesus did when he engaged in this very disruptive behavior was that he reminded us of the purpose of the church. This story should also raise our consciousness to think about how we idolize money in ministry and use it as a barrier to overcome rather than a launching pad to get us off on the way to doing ministry with people and responding to their needs. It should raise our consciousness about how easily we can become preoccupied with fundraising, that we lose sight of the purpose for which we gather. Psalm 100, verse 4 says, "We enter the gates with thanksgiving and the courts with hymns of praise." The church gathers to worship God. That is our primary purpose. There are four other purposes of the church, but worship is our first priority. And may I challenge our perspective this morning by reminding us that we do not come to church. We are the church. And as the church, we have a building on Leslie Street, which we gather to fulfill our purpose. And COVID-19 has made this even more true as we realize that we can be the church without going into the building because it was never about the building. It has always been about the purpose for which we gather. And Jesus went to the temple to drive out the motivations and purposes for which we gather that obscure our real purposes, which are to worship, to fellowship, for discipleship, for ministry and outreach, and for growth through evangelism. He went to the temple to disrupt our routine for a new you and for a new attitude. The third reason that I believe Jesus went to the temple that day and did what he did was to lift our faith from monotony. This story should also remind us that it is not business as usual when it comes on to our faith. But where does business as usual come from? It comes from a fear of uncertainty of the future and our desire to make our lives more predictable and secure. Business as usual is an illusion we create when we do not want to venture into the unfamiliar. But the more of the same, or the same old attitude of our faith, Jesus says, needs to stop. Lent is a time to disrupt the routine and gain a new perspective. The Lenten observances are an opportunity for us to drive out our tendency to measure our faith solely by our contribution. In other words, to measure our faith according to our works. Or tithes and offerings, or time, or talent is not the measure of our faith. They are expressions of faith. And they should grow up and expand out. As we mature in our faith, as we grow up in our understanding of God's love and God's mission in the world, our contributions should also expand in size and impact. We need a change in our perspective. that allows us to express ourselves in our giving with new and renewed zeal for the things of God and for the kingdom building. The commandments, as I heard them again for the in the 40 years I've been hearing them, I am reminded today how much of a blessing they were rather than words of confinement. When God used the word shall, it was in hopeful anticipation of the life that we would live if we were to observe those commandments. You shall. Imagine the 10 commandments again, my friends, as if you are looking on your grandchild or your child for the very first time and thinking to yourself, this child shall grow up. This child shall have everything that they desire. This child shall be healthy and happy. This child shall be all that they can be. And this will be possible because they shall respect people. This child shall have a deep love for God. We don't know how the child is going to turn out, but certainly as we look them in the eyes, as we look at their brand new hair and their brand new little eyes and their brand new hands, we recognize and we hope that if they can simply follow the basic rules of civility, which in Jesus' time were the commandments, that they will have happy and fulfilling lives. That was God's wish for us when God gave the commandments, not to confine us or trap us or prevent us from being free, but to give us some guidelines that will make us fulfilling because we will understand our relationship to God. We will understand that we should love ourselves and we will love and treat people well. The fourth reason that Jesus did what he did is to show that relationship is more important than ritual. This story should remind us that our Lenten observance is an opportunity to drive out the staleness of our Christian walk and prayer life. The money changing and the animal selling were just symptoms of a bigger problem. We can get to the point where we are just repeating words and do not contemplate their meaning. Sometime in the future, I hope to do a series on the Lord's Prayer. Just because we say it en route all the time, but we hardly have time to really understand and deeply reflect on the words that we say. But we can get to the point where we can talk about God, but do not actually know God personally. We can get to the point where service becomes a burden. When we ask you to do something, you feel like we're asking you to transform your life in order to participate. We can lose sight of the reason for service, that Jesus commands us to go into the world, to bring good news to the poor, to set the captive free, to heal the brokenhearted. We can get to the point where we think that the 10 commandments are rules to be followed, when they are more than that. They are the parameters for fostering a healthy relationship, kind of like your marital vows or your code of ethics at work. They are parameters for fostering a healthy relationship, whichever words you chose. The first 5 are how we foster a healthy relationship between God and ourselves. The last 5 are how we foster a healthy relationship between each other. And together, they make for a healthy person with a character of integrity. Ultimately, God is more interested in us than the rules. The rules are for us, And in following them, we can live an abundant life at peace with God, at peace with others, and at peace with ourselves. Jesus went to the temple and through disruption, drew attention to God being more interested in the people than the festival, and that God is more interested in the state of the person's heart than their offering. You remember the story of the poor widow and her two mites and the rich person in the temple. And Jesus was not amused and said that the gift of the lady's two mites was far superior to the wealthy. Not because the temple didn't need money, but because the state of the woman's heart that gave it. Jesus said she gave it from all that she had. On the eve of the Passover, when Jesus did what he did, there will be people who did not get to buy their animal for sacrifice. Worse, that court was the court of women. Even further out was the court of the Gentiles, which meant all the poor people and all the people who were not Jews. So the outsiders and the foreigners and the refugees. And if Jesus drove all those animals out of the that court, it meant that the poor did not get to buy their sacrifices either. And Jesus knew that. But you know what? That was Jesus's point. Even though they didn't get their animals for sacrifice, they will still be acceptable to God. They would still be forgiven. They will still be loved. They would still be provided for because it was never about the sacrifice. It was about the diligence of the heart and the commitment of the heart to follow and to do what God had invited them to do. Jesus would still go to the cross. He would still give his life to seal the relationship between God and humanity. So here is the challenge. For the new you, for the new attitude, you need to disrupt business as usual in your life. Business as usual is destructive to our lives and relationships. It draws our ability to see and participate in the holy that is already present in and among us. If you don't believe me, try having business as usual in a marriage and see how quickly it gets stale and how quickly parties lose interest and move on. Something we don't want them to do since they made a commitment in the beginning to have and to hold or to remain faithful, depending on what words you chose. There needs to be reinvigorated spice. There needs to be a disruption of routine. There needs to be spontaneity. There needs to be zeal and that consumes us and makes us put effort and try different things. It is the same with our faith. Jesus is prepared not just to disrupt our lives with his words and his actions, but he is ready to help us through it if we ask. So here are the questions. What do you want Jesus to drive out of your life so that you can walk a different path? What do you want Jesus to drive out of your life so that you can have a deeper relationship with God? What do you want Jesus to drive out of your life so that you can make the worship life that you have more than an activity that you do on a Sunday morning, so that you can pray more outside of this gathering, so that you can find deeper meaning and insight for prayers and from scripture? What do you want Jesus to drive out of your life so that you can take on a new attitude and view things from a faith perspective? Jesus, the Word, became flesh so that the temple might become human. Jesus, the Word, became flesh so that the temple could become human. Jesus went to the temple to give notice that things were about to change, that the focus was about to change. He was out to bring about change in people and not the building. He was there to draw their attention to the pulling down and the rebuilding of the relationship between God and humanity. A relationship that existed from the beginning but had lost its meaning and had lost its commitment. He was announcing change, however disruptive it might seem. And that change comes from putting things into perspective by driving out things that obscure our view of the holy, ourselves, or of each other. COVID-19 has changed our relationship with our buildings. It has given us an opportunity to build and strengthen our interpersonal relationships and given us time to work on our relationship with God. But if this call to a new you feels like a big change, if this call for a new attitude feels overwhelming, if this call for a change for perspective feels like too much change for you, here is the good news. Jesus never makes us into someone we are not. What he's asking us to do is to return to the better parts of who we are and who we have always been. Remember when you had zeal for your faith. Spring is coming, friends. And spring is a good time to do some physical cleaning. Lent is during spring. I wonder whose idea that was. And Lent is a good time to do some spiritual cleaning for a new you and a new attitude. Amen.